Welcome back to another Kray video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any videos. And for people really into the Krays, join our private Facebook group, Krays Crime Lords of London, where you will find stuff probably unavailable anywhere else. We're an established group with a large membership, and best of all, we're friendly. The link is in the YouTube description section.
My name is Leonard Reed. I was known as Nipper Reed. I was born in Nottingham on the 31st of March in 1925. During my working life, I was a policeman and rose to the rank of Detective Chief Superintendent of the Metropolitan Police's murder squad. I led the investigation into the eventual arrest and conviction of the Kray twins and their firm in 1968 and 1969. Away from my police work, my passion was boxing, and I became a boxing administrator, a position I held for many years. Here is my story. Being in charge of this case was a great privilege, and I was always conscious of the outstanding work rate of my firm. The Kray case wasn't the biggest case of all time, nor perhaps the most important. It did, however, signal the end of an era. With the convictions in the case, organized crime in London on the scale on which they operated was ended. Of their time, however, photographed by the fashionable, mixing with the stars, they were as much part of the 60s as Twiggy, the minicar, and the miniskirt. Perhaps the way the Krays were regarded in the East End is summed up by the attitude of a man I interviewed. He had been a prosperous businessman in good health and socially secure. Now, as a result of persistent pressure from the firm, he was a sick, penniless outcast. I pointed out to him that he had been ruined physically, socially, and financially by the twins, and he agreed. But Mr. Reed, he said, they're such nice fellas. Back in the 1960s, there was no such thing as privacy at the Old Bailey. Jurors, police, solicitors, counsel, witnesses, if they were still around, and defendants in the next case milled around in the hallway. Friends and relatives mostly waited downstairs in the canteen for the verdict. All through the trial, the matron had let us use her room, which was off the main hall, almost opposite the number 2 court, for a bit of privacy. A big Scotswoman with ginger hair, showing a bit grey at the roots, Mrs. Hamlin stood no nonsense from anyone. That day, she made endless cups of tea. The jury had been sent out shortly after midday, and it was now early evening. Again, those days were different. Now, a jury on anything a bit more serious than a shoplifting case can look forward to at least one night in a hotel. But in the 1960s, a retirement anything longer than 2 hours was rare. It was said that a verdict in the first hour meant a conviction, in the second hour an acquittal, and after that it swung back and forth. There were no majority verdicts. One person, stubborn, unconvinced, got at, could force a retrial. It was just after 7 p.m. on that evening of Tuesday, the 4th of March 1969, when a City of London copper put his head around the door. "They're back, Governor." You get so many false alarms. Sometimes "they're back" means everyone goes back into court, and the atmosphere becomes electric until the foreman of the jury stands up and asks, "Can we see Exhibit 6 again, please?" Or, "What is the burden of proof?" Which means they haven't understood anything that has gone on for the past week. The jury had not done this the whole afternoon, and we had the nod they had reached verdicts. "This is it," I said to Frank Cater, who had been with me throughout the long afternoon. He took a last drag at his cigarette, stubbed it in the overloaded ashtray, and together we walked across the hallway and turned right towards number 1 court. We sat in our usual places underneath the jury box, itself at right angles to the dock. No question in those days of the jury being out of sight from the public gallery. Anxiously, we scanned the jurors' faces. There's a theory, or more properly a superstition, that if there is to be an acquittal, particularly in a serious case, then, as they file back into court, the jurors will look at the defendants. This time, it was different. The judge, Melford Stevenson, had decided that, to prevent any outburst, the defendants should be brought up one at a time. Counsel and solicitors fiddled with their papers, trying to appear calm, but there is no calm at the end of an important trial, just a feeling of an incipient panic, which has to be shut down. As the judge came into court, there was a buzz in the public gallery, quelled immediately by one of the policeman ushers. My mouth was dry, and I knew that if I put out my hand, I wouldn't be able to stop my fingers shaking. All we had done, all we had worked for, would be made useless by one single word. The clerk of the court was Leslie Boyd, a tall, elegant man who read out the first counts on the indictment, asking the jury if they had reached their verdicts. Would the foreman please stand? Mr. Foreman, would you answer me first of all, just yes or no? Members of the jury, with regard to Ronald Kray, have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed? Yes, sir, replied the foreman, now for a few brief moments the single most important person in the court. He seemed a little taken aback at the echo of his voice. Do you find the prisoner Ronald Kray guilty or not guilty on the first count of murder? Guilty. I can't say the rest didn't matter, of course they did, but that was the one that really counted. Cater put his hand on my shoulder to murmur congratulations. Boyd and the foreman continued their dialogue through the counts on the indictment and through the defendants one by one. I only half heard them as I thought of the long hours my team had put in over the months, the careful compilation of evidence, the watching, the waiting, the planning, the persuading and the pleading with witnesses to come forward and tell the court what had really happened in the London underworld of the 1960s. All of it seemed so long ago, so remote, but although it was then the longest murder trial in legal history, it was only 38 days since the trial had started. It seemed a lifetime. I didn't look up in response to Frank's touch. I was afraid people would see the tears in my eyes. People say the Krays had a deprived upbringing and that this could have been what turned them to crime, but I reckon there was more money coming into their house than into ours. Their father seems to have been something of a wanderer, but overall they were a close-knit family. I won my first medal for boxing at school when I weighed something like 4 stone 7. I can't remember much about the contest. It couldn't have been a crowd puller at that weight. I do know my father was very proud when I brought home the medal, and even more so that I had my picture in the Nottingham Evening Post. Many years later, I asked him where the medal was, but he said he didn't know. It was only after his death, going through his possessions, that I found it carefully wrapped in tissue paper in a little box marked Len's First Medal, 1937. I joined the Grundy Boxing Club, later to become the rather grander-sounding Nottingham School of Boxing, which spawned such great champions as Harold Graham and Kirkland Lang. It was there I got the nickname Nipper. I left school at 14, although I had had hopes that I might go on to Nottingham High School. I passed all the examinations, but there was a penalty involved. My father would have had to pay certain fees for books, a uniform and so on, and that was impossible. I knew there was no possibility really, but later in life I began to resent the fact that I had never been given the opportunity to stretch myself scholastically. My father felt this, and for years afterwards, when we spoke of it, he would go to great lengths apologizing, making the point that in the circumstances, it would have been impossible to support me. He lived to see me become the Assistant Chief Constable of Nottingham, and he was inordinately proud of my appointment. I am glad he had that satisfaction. When he was out of work during the Depression years, it had wounded him deeply. He had spent days tramping round Nottingham looking for work to support his young family, and he never forgot it. His philosophy was that you must never be out of work, and he drummed that message into all his children. He must have been impressive, because none of us ever were. When I left school, my good leaving report made it easy for me to find a job. Dated the 30th of March, 1939, it read, "Leonard Reed leaves this school on April 5th. The fact that he has been in the top form and that he is a school prefect is eloquent testimony to his intelligence and to his reliability and excellent behavior. He is a keen mathematician, gets thoroughly interested in his work, and is most industrious. He gives most willing service, never hangs about, and is absolutely trustworthy. I recommend him confidently." The job was in a wholesale tobacconist's warehouse. I was paid the princely sum of 10 shillings a week, gave 8 to my stepmother, and kept 2. At that time, Nottingham was a mecca for major industrial concerns. There was the Players Tobacco Factory, the Raleigh Cycles Company, Boots the Chemist, Bairns Ware, Vivella, and a host of other textile companies, but Players was the big attraction. Most young people in Nottingham set their sights on getting a job with them. My 2 sisters worked at Players, and this gave me an entree, as family connections such as this were encouraged. The wages were good, and they paid a lump sum bonus. This made it a most attractive proposition. If you stayed there until you were 40, you were assured of a nice home and a small car. It was that kind of job, safe, sound, and well paid. I worked in the basement of number 1 factory as a feeder. It was my job to feed the raw leaf tobacco into the back of a machine, which turned it into cigarette tobacco. The machines had enormous blades which cut through the leaf at high speed, and the resulting noise, heat, dust, and stench were unbearable. The conditions were really horrific, and yet as a young lad I didn't seem to mind it much. There was a good spirit amongst the employees, and we had fun. I don't think I ever contemplated it as a career, however. Some years later, I met one of the chaps who had worked with me. He had become a manager of a number of the factories. He had a large house in the poshest part of Nottingham, and he drove a Mercedes. As I said, the rewards were good if you stuck at it. I was there just on 2 years, until in April 1943, when I was called up for service in the Royal Navy and posted to the frigate HMS Ganges, the naval training base at Harwich. I had never been outside Nottingham, and for a time, the dialects defeated me. I could not work out how a man who insisted he was a Cockney could come from Oban, which I knew perfectly well was in Scotland. Of course, he meant Holborn in central London. My paybook photograph shows me as a frightened-looking young man with close-cropped hair and wide-staring eyes. It must have shown something about me, because in the early summer I went before a naval psychologist who decided I could do better than swabbing decks, and I was packed off to the Naval College to be an engineer. It may sound grand, but it wasn't. At that time the college was in Harrods Warehouse in Fulham, not in Greenwich. From there, I qualified as a mechanic, was promoted leading seaman, and, in early 1944, equipped with all the right gear, thick woolen stockings, heavy Arctic underwear, duffel coats and thick sea boots, I was on my way to the heat and humidity of the Far East. Whilst I was in the Navy, I was determined that on my D-mob I wouldn't go back to Players amongst all that dirt and tannin. By law, my job was still open to me, but I had no intention of returning. My life in the Navy had given me freedom. My education had been broadened. I had met a delightful man, Eric Steely, a well-spoken and intelligent man who had worked as a shipping clerk in the docks in the East End. We had discussed what future we contemplated after the war, and he said that on his discharge he was going to join the police. When I asked him why, he said it was an outdoor life, with a certain amount of freedom to make decisions, and of course, it was a career with a pension at the end of it. This was something that was always in my mind. To me, there was never the possibility of doing my own thing, starting my own business. I was born and educated in a period when it was drummed into you that you should have a career, perhaps in the post office, the railways, the forces, something that was totally secure. That was the thing to aim for. My father had been unemployed. I'd seen unemployment. He'd always said there must never be a day when you're out of work. After all, the day after I left school, I had started work. My friend Eric's words made a considerable impression on me. I was demobbed in December 1946 with the rank of petty officer, and I had a month's leave. My father was nagging me to get a job. He was then a senior foreman in a clothing factory, and he urged me to go down there with him. I'd come out of the Navy with another man who lived locally, and my father suggested we should both go down to his factory to look the place over. We said we would. My father started this other fellow and was furious when I wouldn't join the firm. You've got to get started again. You don't want to be idle. It was a sin, especially when there was work being offered. I looked around with my father getting to be a pain, nagging me to get a job, and I decided I had two options, either go back in the Navy or join the police force. I knew I could get back in the Navy as a chief petty officer or something of that kind, but I didn't have much hope for the police because I was too small. It was a wild card. No way could I join the Nottingham force because there was a minimum 6-foot height requirement. It could only be the Metropolitan Police in London, whose minimum was 4 inches shorter. So off I wrote and got an interview with a civil service examination, a medical, and an interview on the one day at Beak Street, just off Regent Street. I knew I'd romped through the civil service exam. There wasn't any question about that. But as for the medical, I must have weighed under 10 stone, and I was certainly under 5'8". The bloke who was doing the business was a sergeant who, after he'd looked me over, said, "Good God, son, if you're accepted, you'll have to take some stretching exercises because you don't really qualify." Of course I said, adding hopefully, "I'm still growing." Then I went before the board and was asked why I wanted to join the police. I said I'd done over 3 years in the Navy, which was such a difference from working in a factory. I said I saw the police as a career, and that it was an open-air life. Then, when I was asked about sport, off I went. Football, boxing, and I'd played hockey and cricket for the Royal Navy. I told them about the time I took 10 wickets for 11 runs for the Navy against the Royal Indian Navy. I could see in my mind they're marking this down as a plus because the Metropolitan Police, the Met, had always had a very good sporting record. The fact that I'd been in the forces was also a plus because I knew what discipline was, and that would not present problems. The other thing in my favor was that there had been no recruiting during the war years, and they were desperate for men. Perhaps when it came to it, they were taking almost anyone. I came to London as a police probationer in the bitterly cold February of 1947. The Thames was frozen over, snow was thick on the streets for almost the whole month, and over London there was the noise of bursting pipes and an air of depression and despair. Rationing was still in force. We all still carried identity cards. Bomb damage was visible in every borough, if not in every street. Emergency air raid shelters and water tanks lined those streets, and ex-army surplus was as much standard clothing as jeans are today. training was a 12-week stint at the old Hendon Police College. There was drilling and lectures on public order, diseases of animals, child neglect, company fraud, incest, rape, bigamy, sodomy, helping children at school crossings, suicide, infanticide, drunks, down and outs, prostitutes, ponces, and traffic control. Everything which made a policeman's life worth living. The discipline was by no means as strict as the Royal Navy's version, and so it was fun. Fun, but still frightening, because as the weeks went by, I realized that what was theory was soon going to be practice. Everything was taught in the school. We did not go outside the walls for experience. Accidents were staged for us, and we had to report on them. I felt terribly inferior when I was picked on to make the report. Even today, I hate making speeches. I've never really kept in contact with the others who were at college with me. One, Dickie Day, was posted with me and I still see him, but the others were scattered far and wide. Some of them certainly became middle-ranking officers, but none exactly hit the heights. Apart from passing the written and oral examinations at the end of the course, speculation grew amongst us on our posting. Some areas were more highly sought than others. At least I knew I would not be sent to A Division, which covered the city of Westminster. Officers there were on duty at the Palace and the Houses of Parliament. They were seen as setting an example of the Metropolitan Police and had to be at least 6 feet tall. Otherwise, it depended on your attitude, because good was generally considered as far away from the centre as possible. Ealing or Esher were thought to be marvellous. They were nice, quiet areas with no problems. The grotty areas were the East End, Kentish Town, and West End Central. I became a member of the boxing team at the training school and won for the first time a major competition, the Lafone Cup. I was also in training for the police championships. Certain divisions were known for their boxing teams. In the late 1940s, it was G, whose area was Hoxton, and N, who covered Kentish Town, who had the best teams, and it was possible I would be sent to join one of them. In fact, when the announcement came on our passing out parade, I was told I was going to D Division, which then comprised the areas of Regent's Park, Marylebone, Paddington, and Camden Town. So much for their belief in my boxing ability. But I was delighted at the time, and with hindsight, it could not have been better for me. That brings to an end the first part of my story. I hope you have enjoyed it. Please join me again in the next one. Thank you for watching.
If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly, moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.